Number 10. The Johnstown flood. Some disasters feel like acts of nature. Others feel like nature used as the final weapon in a tragedy that human decisions had already set in motion. The Johnstown flood belongs to that second category, and that is why it still feels so disturbing more than a century later. In 1889, the town of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, sat in a valley already vulnerable to water, industry, and bad luck. Heavy rains had fallen, conditions were dangerous, but danger alone does not explain why the catastrophe became so apocalyptic. Looming above the town was the South Fork Dam, a structure with a troubled history, altered and neglected after passing into the hands of wealthy club owners whose private resort depended on the lake it held back. Concerns had been raised, repairs had been improvised, warning signs existed, and then the dam failed. What followed was not merely a flood. It was a wall of water, debris, timber, mud, wire, machinery, and shattered buildings crashing down into Johnstown with almost unimaginable force. Entire families disappeared in moments. Houses were ripped from foundations and carried like driftwood. People who survived the first impact were thrown into a landscape so violently transformed that it no longer resembled a town at all. And when the wreckage piled up and caught fire, the horror became even worse. It was not one disaster. It was many disasters arriving together in one unstoppable surge. That much is known. What has never stopped troubling people is the question beneath it. How much of this was preventable? The official shape of the event could be described in broad terms: heavy rain, structural failure, flood. But that explanation has always felt too clean for the moral reality surrounding the case. Because the dam had a history. Its modifications mattered, its maintenance mattered, the social hierarchy around it mattered. The fact that ordinary people lived below while powerful men enjoyed leisure above has haunted the story from the beginning. The flood did not only destroy a town, it exposed a structure of privilege in which risk flowed downward long before the water did. That is why the Johnstown flood still feels larger than a 19th century engineering collapse. It sits at the intersection of nature, negligence, and accountability, where one of history's most familiar post-disaster patterns begins to emerge. Everyone agrees that something terrible happened. Fewer people agree on how honestly the system around it was ever judged. Lawsuits failed, responsibility blurred, public outrage surged and then hardened into the frustrating realization that catastrophe does not always produce justice. Sometimes it produces mourning, then narrative, then silence. And time only deepened that silence. Because the farther the event moved into history, the easier it became to frame it as one more great American disaster, dramatic but finished. Yet the unanswered questions remained embedded in it. Were the warnings taken seriously enough? Were the repairs ever adequate? Could lives have been saved if danger had been treated as danger rather than inconvenience? Those are the kinds of questions that rarely disappear after mass death. They simply become part of the moral afterlife of the event. That is why the Johnstown flood belongs on this list. Not because we do not know what physically happened, but because disasters are never only physical. The water came, the dam broke, the town was devastated. But the deeper question, who allowed the conditions for such devastation to exist, was never resolved in a way that feels equal to the scale of the loss. In that sense, the flood did not just leave ruins behind. It left behind doubt. And sometimes doubt is the most enduring wreckage of all. Number 9. The Halifax explosion. There are disasters so violent that they seem to tear reality itself in half. The Halifax explosion was one of those events. In December 1917, in the harbour of Halifax, Nova Scotia, 2 ships collided. One of them, the Mont Blanc, was loaded with a catastrophic cargo of wartime explosives. At first, the situation was still within the realm of accident, confusion, and possible containment. There was fire. There was panic. There was movement along the waterfront. People gathered, watched, hesitated, speculated. Then the harbour detonated. The blast that followed was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. An entire section of the city was obliterated, buildings were flattened, windows shattered for miles. Ships were hurled by the force, fires broke out. A pressure wave tore through homes, streets, and bodies, with such suddenness that thousands of lives were changed before people could even comprehend what they were seeing. In the immediate aftermath, the disaster seemed almost too large to describe in normal language. It did not feel like one event. It felt like the violent end of an entire world compressed into seconds. And yet even here, in a catastrophe so visible and so thoroughly documented, the unanswered questions did not disappear. Because mass destruction never arrives in a vacuum. It arrives through systems, decisions, procedures, assumptions, and failures that only become fully visible once the damage is done. How did such a collision happen in a busy wartime harbour? Were the right warnings given quickly enough? Could the fire have been recognized for what it truly meant before the explosion occurred? Did bureaucracy, communication breakdown, or complacency turn danger into annihilation? These are the kinds of questions disasters leave behind when the physical cause is known, but the chain of human failure remains harder to settle. The Halifax explosion is especially haunting because of how thin the line was between ordinary motion and total devastation. Ships moved through a harbour, smoke rose, people looked on, then a city was shattered. That transformation is what gives the event its enduring power. Disasters often terrify us because they reveal vulnerability. Halifax terrified in another way. It revealed how quickly a normal morning can become historical trauma when risk is present but not fully understood by those standing closest to it. The harbour looked like a place of commerce and wartime movement. It was in reality awaiting detonation, and time has only made that realization heavier. Because the more the explosion is remembered, the more it becomes not just a story of blast force, but of invisible escalation. There was a sequence, a collision, a fire, a delay, a failure to fully grasp what was about to happen. Those moments matter because they are where catastrophe often hides its true lesson. The explosion itself feels sudden, but the unanswered questions live in the minutes before it, where human beings were still acting inside uncertainty, and where history later returns, searching for the exact point at which horror became inevitable. That point is never easy to locate. Was the disaster sealed the instant the ships collided? Or was there still a narrow chance to reduce the toll if warnings had spread differently, if procedures had been clearer, if people had recognized the fire not as spectacle but as apocalypse approaching? These are not abstract questions. They shape how societies understand responsibility after calamity. And as with so many disasters, the dead do not receive full clarity. The living inherit interpretation instead. That is why the Halifax explosion still feels unsettled. Yes, the event has an explanation. Yes, the physical chain is known in broad outline. But explanation is not the same as closure. Closure would require the sense that the disaster had been fully understood, morally and structurally, and that its lessons had been cleanly extracted from the ruins. Events like Halifax resist that comfort. They remain too sudden, too immense, and too full of human proximity to danger. In the end, the explosion did more than destroy a cityscape. It exposed how catastrophe can gather quietly inside routine until one final moment makes every earlier decision feel unbearable. And long after the smoke cleared, that remained the most frightening question of all. Not what exploded, but how many people were standing inside history's blast radius before anyone truly understood it. Number 8. The Mount St. Helens, eruption, natural disasters often seem easier to understand than human-made ones. A mountain erupts. The earth releases pressure. The event is terrible, but the cause appears straightforward. Yet Mount St. Helens left behind a different kind of unease, because even when nature is clearly responsible, the unanswered questions do not disappear. They shift toward warning, prediction, boundaries, and how close human confidence can come to disaster before the landscape decides otherwise. In 1980, Mount St. Helens had already been signaling unrest. Earthquakes increased, steam explosions appeared. The mountain itself began to deform, swelling in a way that alarmed scientists and drew growing public attention. By the time the Great Eruption came on May 18th, the volcano was not a silent threat. It was a visible one. People knew something serious was unfolding. Experts were watching. Restricted zones had been established. The country was staring at the mountain as if waiting for a verdict. And then the north face collapsed. What followed was not merely an eruption in the popular sense. It was a lateral blast of astonishing force, a catastrophic release that flattened forests, killed dozens of people, and transformed the landscape into something that looked almost extraterrestrial. Trees fell in patterns like matchsticks. Ash spread across vast distances. Entire valleys were devastated. The eruption rewrote the terrain with a violence that made ordinary language feel inadequate. It was one of those moments when nature seemed to reveal not just power, but a kind of indifference so complete that human observation felt painfully small beside it. Yet even here, the disaster left behind difficult questions. Because the tragedy was not only about volcanic force, it was also about where people were, what they believed, and how risk is negotiated in the shadow of scientific uncertainty. Some of the dead were inside restricted areas without authorization. Others were there legally or with permission. Some stayed because of work, some because of attachment to place, some because warnings did not fully overcome instinct, routine, or hope. The eruption became a case study not just in geology, but in the limits of hazard management. How far should authorities go in restricting access? How certain must science be before governments impose absolute control? When a danger zone exists around a living mountain, what counts as caution and what counts as overreach? Those questions have never fully gone away. Mount St. Helens is often remembered through its iconic images: the ash cloud, the blast zone, the ruined landscape, the before and after shape of the mountain. But the unanswered questions live in the human edge of the event. Could more lives have been saved with stricter enforcement? Were the risks understood clearly enough by everyone involved? Did some people die because the disaster was too sudden? Or because the language of warning can never quite compete with familiarity, skepticism, or the belief that disaster will strike somewhere else? The eruption did not just test volcanic science. It tested the relationship between knowledge and obedience, and time only sharpened that tension. Because the more we learn about volcanoes, the clearer it becomes that scientific forecasting is powerful but never perfect. Hazard maps, seismic monitoring, deformation measurements, gas emissions, all of it matters, and all of it still exists inside uncertainty. Mount St. Helens exposed that uncomfortable truth in dramatic form. Society wants experts to know enough to save everyone, but disasters often reveal a gap between what experts can identify and what institutions or individuals are prepared to do with that knowledge. That is why this eruption still feels unsettled. Yes, the mountain erupted. Yes, the physical chain of events is broadly understood. But understanding the eruption is not the same as resolving the deeper questions it raised. How do people live beside a threat they can see but not predict with perfect confidence? How should power respond when science says danger is likely, but not exactly when or how it will strike? And how many disasters are remembered as natural only because history finds it easier to blame the Earth than to interrogate the human choices made around it? Mount St. Helens left behind more than ash and broken timber. It left behind a warning about the limits of foresight itself. And that warning is still echoing. Number 7. The Tenerife airport disaster. Some disasters are terrifying because of violent mechanical failure. Others are terrifying because almost nothing seems to go wrong in the spectacular sense until it is far too late. The Tenerife airport disaster remains one of the clearest examples of that second kind of horror, because it emerged not from one dramatic breakdown, but from a chain of delays, misunderstandings, assumptions, and pressure building quietly inside routine. In March 1977, two Boeing 747s, one operated by KLM and the other by Pan Am, ended up on the same runway at Los Rodeos Airport on Tenerife in the Canary Islands. A bomb explosion at another airport had diverted traffic. Congestion grew. Conditions became unusual. The smaller airport was suddenly handling more than it was built for. Taxiways were limited. Communication became more strained. Fog drifted over the field, reducing visibility and turning an already awkward situation into something far more dangerous. That is what makes the disaster so haunting from the beginning. Nothing about the early stages looks like apocalypse. It looks like disruption, delay, procedure under stress, the sort of airport confusion that people assume can be managed by professionals. And then, within that atmosphere of mounting pressure, one aircraft began its takeoff roll while the other was still on the runway. The result was catastrophic. The collision and explosion killed hundreds of people, making it the deadliest accident in aviation history. But what continues to haunt Tenerife is not only the scale of death, it is the unbearable familiarity of the ingredients, radio communication that was not perfectly clear, hierarchy in the cockpit, time pressure, weather, ambiguous phrasing, assumptions filling the gaps where certainty should have been. The disaster has been studied endlessly because it feels less like an isolated freak event and more like a revelation of how fragile safety becomes when human systems begin to overlap in the wrong sequence. Nothing supernatural was required. No exotic sabotage, no impossible coincidence, just ordinary professional environments pushed into a pattern where small uncertainties multiplied faster than anyone could correct them. That pattern is where the unanswered questions live. Because Tenerife is often presented as a solved disaster, and in one sense it is. The broad chain is known, the communications have been analysed, the operational failures are studied in training and safety culture to this day. But solved does not mean emotionally closed. The central questions remain deeply unsettling. At what exact moment did the disaster become irreversible? Could one clearer phrase, one more assertive challenge, 1 second of hesitation, one different decision in fog have prevented the entire event? Disasters like Tenerife leave history with a cruel structure. Everything becomes obvious after the fire. Before it, people are still moving inside uncertainty. That is why the event has such lasting power. It does not merely expose one mistake. It exposes the human tendency to treat partial understanding as enough. A captain hears what he expects to hear. A controller means one thing, but phrases it imperfectly. A crew senses ambiguity, but does not break hierarchy forcefully enough. A second aircraft is still where it should not be, but hidden by conditions that reduce immediate reality to voice and procedure. By the time those fragments align into recognition, the runway is no longer a place of controlled departure. It is a trap. And time has only deepened the meaning of that trap. Because Tenerife became more than a disaster. It became a warning embedded in aviation culture itself. Crew resource management, communication standards, cockpit hierarchy, procedural clarity, all were reshaped in part because of what happened there. That legacy matters, but it also carries a darker implication. The lessons were written in mass death. History learned, but it learned by first allowing a preventable chain to reach its conclusion. That is where the unanswered question becomes hardest to ignore. Was Tenerife simply a tragic convergence of conditions, or was it the inevitable result of a system that had not yet taken human factors seriously enough? That distinction matters. One frames the event as near accidental. The other suggests that the disaster was waiting to happen somewhere, and that Tenerife was only the place where the hidden weakness finally became visible. Even now, that possibility makes the case feel larger than one runway in one fog-bound moment. The Tenerife airport disaster left behind wreckage, fire, and a death toll history we'll never forget. But it also left behind something more troubling. Proof that catastrophe can emerge not only from spectacular failure, but from professionalism operating just slightly out of alignment with reality, until the difference between routine and annihilation becomes only a few misunderstood words. Number 6. The Bhopal gas tragedy. Some disasters leave behind wreckage you can photograph. Others leave behind something more insidious, air that cannot be seen, poison that cannot be outrun, and a death toll that does not end when dawn arrives. The Bhopal gas tragedy belongs to that second category, and that is why it remains one of the most disturbing industrial disasters in modern history. In December 1984, in Bhopal, India, a lethal gas leak escaped from a pesticide plant operated by Union Carbide India Limited. During the night, methyl isocyanate and other toxic substances spread into densely populated neighborhoods surrounding the facility. People woke choking, blinded, disoriented, unable to understand what was happening before the gas was already inside their lungs and eyes. Families ran through darkness without knowing which direction meant safety. Many never got far enough to find out. What followed was horror on a scale that no industrial accident should ever be allowed to reach. Thousands died in the immediate aftermath. Many more suffered injuries that scarred them for life. And beyond the first wave of death came something even more haunting. The disaster did not truly end. Survivors carried long-term respiratory illness, damaged vision, neurological problems, reproductive harm, and intergenerational consequences that continued to shadow families long after the world's headlines moved on. Bhopal was not just a night of mass death. It became a long echo of chemical exposure that history still has not fully finished counting. And that is where the unanswered questions begin. Because the broad outline of the event is known. Toxic gas leaked. Safety systems failed or proved insufficient. Communities nearby were devastated. But the deeper question that has never stopped haunting the case is how such a failure was allowed to become possible in the first place. What corners had been cut? What warnings had been missed, ignored, or tolerated? Were maintenance standards allowed to decline? Were safety mechanisms inadequate, inactive, or compromised at the worst possible moment? How much did cost, negligence, regulatory weakness, and inequality contribute to an event later described as tragic, as though tragedy were a force of nature rather than a consequence of decisions? That distinction matters enormously, because Bhopal was not just an accident in the abstract sense. It was an industrial disaster embedded in structures of power. Corporate decisions, uneven enforcement, dangerous proximity between hazardous production and vulnerable populations, and the old historical pattern in which poorer communities bear risks that wealthier systems would never tolerate near themselves. The gas did not drift into emptiness. It drifted into human lives already positioned inside a zone of invisible inequality. That is why Bhopal still feels morally unresolved. The chemistry may be studied, but accountability never felt equal to the suffering, and time only made that imbalance more obvious. Because years passed, and with them came disputes over compensation, responsibility, cleanup, medical recognition, and the full scope of the damage. Survivors did not inherit closure, they inherited bureaucracy. Legal settlements came under criticism. Questions about corporate liability and justice lingered. Contaminated sites and long-term health concerns continued to keep the disaster in the present tense, long after outsiders preferred to treat it as history. In that way, Bhopal became more than a catastrophe. It became a case study in how modern systems absorb mass suffering without fully answering for it. That is what gives the tragedy its enduring darkness. The toxic cloud killed in hours. The unanswered questions lasted decades. Could the leak have been prevented? Almost certainly. Could the toll have been reduced by stronger safeguards, more honest oversight, better emergency planning, and more respect for the lives around the plant? The weight of history points painfully in that direction, yet the exact boundaries of blame, failure, and institutional evasion remain contested enough that the event still feels unfinished. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part. Bhopal is often remembered as one of the worst industrial disasters ever recorded. That is true, but it is also one of the clearest examples of how disaster does not merely expose weakness. It exposes what a system was willing to risk before the public was forced to look at it directly. The gas made the invisible visible for one terrible night. After that, the world had no excuse not to understand what had been building beneath the surface. The dead were not lost to mystery. They were lost to a chain of human choices whose full moral meaning history still has not resolved. Number 5. The Challenger disaster. Some disasters become defining because millions witnessed them in the same instant. The Challenger disaster was one of those moments, and that public visibility is part of what made its unanswered questions so painful. This was not a catastrophe discovered after the fact in wreckage or silence. It unfolded in the open sky, before cameras, schoolchildren, and a nation that had been taught to see spaceflight as risk managed by expertise. In January 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger launched from Cape Canaveral carrying 7 crew members, including Krista McAuliffe, whose presence as a teacher aboard the mission had drawn extraordinary public attention. The shuttle rose normally, familiar and triumphant for a brief moment, and then, just over a minute into flight, it broke apart. The image burned itself into public memory immediately. Trails in the sky, shock on the ground, disbelief spreading faster than comprehension. The disaster felt impossible because it happened inside a system people had learned to trust. Spaceflight had always involved danger, but by the mid-1980s the shuttle program was also presented as routine, repeatable, almost operational in the way commercial systems aspire to be. That was part of its promise and part of the tragedy. When Challenger was destroyed, the event did not only kill 7 astronauts, it shattered the illusion that institutional confidence and technological prestige were enough to contain the risks they were carrying upward. And the deeper investigators looked, the more uncomfortable the questions became. The technical cause centered on failure of O-ring seals in unusually cold conditions, but the enduring power of the disaster lies in the fact that the technical cause was never the whole story. Concerns had existed. Engineers had warned about the effects of low temperature on the solid rocket booster joints. Debate had occurred. Managers made decisions anyway. The launch proceeded. That sequence transformed the event from tragic failure into something more morally disturbing. A disaster that appeared to emerge not from pure unpredictability, but from known risk moving through an institutional culture unable or unwilling to stop itself in time. That is the point where many disasters become historically radioactive. Because once warning enters the story, the question changes. It is no longer only what failed. It becomes who knew enough to hesitate, and why was hesitation overruled? In the Challenger disaster, that question has haunted every retelling. Was the launch schedule under too much pressure? Did communication between engineers and decision-makers break down under institutional demands? Did the normalization of risk make danger feel acceptable simply because catastrophe had not yet occurred? These questions matter because they push the disaster beyond mechanics and into the territory of culture, hierarchy, and denial. And time has only made that cultural dimension more significant. The disaster is now remembered not just as an aerospace failure, but as a warning about organizations themselves. Brilliant institutions can still become vulnerable to self-deception. Repeated success can make anomalies feel tolerable. Prestige can make delay feel like weakness. People closest to the danger can speak and still not be heard with the force required to stop the machine. That is why Challenger continues to feel larger than one exploded shuttle. It exposed how catastrophe can grow inside the gap between technical knowledge and institutional behavior. The public nature of the event made that exposure impossible to hide. A quiet failure might have remained internal, softened by language, contained by procedure. Challenger broke apart in front of the world. After that, the official story could never be just one of unfortunate chance. Too many people had seen the moment. Too many investigations revealed the chain behind it. And yet, even with those findings, the unease did not disappear, because understanding how it happened only sharpened the pain of knowing that the warning signs had not been meaningless after all. That is why the disaster still leaves unanswered questions. Not because the engineering mystery remains unsolved, but because the human lesson remains permanently troubling. How often do institutions move forward while privately carrying doubt? How many decisions are framed as acceptable only because previous danger did not yet become disaster? How many tragedies look sudden from the outside while slowly becoming possible on the inside? Challenger survives in history because it forces those questions into the open with unbearable clarity. The shuttle did not just explode, trust did too, and once trust is part of the wreckage, a disaster never really stays in the past. Number 4. The Chernobyl explosion. Some disasters are remembered through images, others are remembered through atmosphere. Chernobyl is one of the few that lingers as both. A reactor building torn open. A night sky lit by something no one should ever see. Firefighters climbing into a situation they do not yet understand. A city still sleeping nearby. And beneath all of it, a truth so dangerous that the first hours of the disaster were shaped not only by radiation, but by confusion, denial, and delay. In April 1986, at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine, a late-night safety test spiraled into catastrophe. Reactor 4 exploded, rupturing the core and releasing massive amounts of radioactive material into the environment. The immediate event was violent enough to be unmistakable, but the meaning of it was not. In the first moments, not everyone grasped the scale. The invisible nature of radiation made the disaster uniquely deceptive. Buildings could still stand, roads could still exist, air could still be breathed. And yet the environment had already become hostile in a way that defied ordinary human instinct. That is part of what makes Chernobyl so haunting. It was not only an explosion, it was an explosion inside reality itself, because the visible damage, as terrible as it was, told only a fraction of the story. The greater danger moved in silence through particles, wind, dust, clothing, skin, machinery, food, and time. People walked through contamination without understanding it. Workers responded under impossible conditions. Residents in nearby Pripyat watched the strange glow and continued life briefly within the shadow of something already changing their fate. The disaster unfolded not just as destruction, but as delayed recognition, which is often the most terrifying form a catastrophe can take. And that is where the unanswered questions begin to deepen. Yes, the broad technical chain has been examined extensively. Design flaws, procedural violations, unsafe testing conditions, and systemic weaknesses all played their roles. But Chernobyl has never belonged only to engineering. It belongs equally to secrecy, bureaucracy, and the political culture that shaped the response. How much was understood in those first hours, and by whom? How long did official hesitation worsen the danger? Were key truths delayed because institutions could not admit the scale of failure quickly enough? In a system built on control of information, a disaster like Chernobyl was never just a reactor event. It was also a crisis of truth itself. That is why the explosion continues to feel larger than its physical site. Because the radiation spread across borders, but so did the symbolic meaning. Chernobyl became a word for institutional failure under pressure, for the deadly cost of hiding reality behind official confidence, for what happens when a state fears disorder so much that it risks compounding catastrophe through silence. The reactor core burned, but the unanswered questions live in the human landscape around it. Who knew, who spoke, who delayed, who was sacrificed, and how much of the early suffering was intensified by the inability of power to tell the truth fast enough? Time has not made those questions smaller. If anything, it has made them sharper. The more the event has been studied, the more Chernobyl appears not as one isolated anomaly, but as the result of layered vulnerability. Technical flaws, cultural flaws, administrative flaws. A machinery of authority that could operate impressively under routine conditions, yet became dangerously brittle when confronted with a reality too large to fit the script. That is why Chernobyl still unsettles even people who know the broad story. Knowledge of the cause does not erase the deeper dread. It amplifies it. Because once you understand the chain, you realize this was not merely an explosion in a reactor. It was an explosion in a system that had trained itself to postpone bad truth, and disasters become far darker when truth itself is part of the delay. Chernobyl left behind a ruined plant, poisoned land, shattered health, and a zone where absence became part of the landscape. But it also left behind one of the most enduring unanswered questions in disaster history. When catastrophe began that night, did the greatest danger come from radiation alone, or from how long human beings remained trapped inside a political culture that could not face it honestly? That question is why Chernobyl still glows in history long after the fire was extinguished. Number 3. The Hindenburg disaster. Some disasters survive in memory because of scale. Others survive because they are captured in a single unforgettable instant. The Hindenburg disaster belongs to that second category. Few images in modern history are as immediately recognizable. The giant airship engulfed in flame, collapsing before witnesses, transforming luxury, ambition, and spectacle into horror within seconds. In May 1937, the German passenger airship LZ-129 Hindenburg approached its mooring mast at Lakehurst, New Jersey, after crossing the Atlantic. It represented more than transportation. It represented a certain dream of modernity, grand, elegant, slower than airplanes, but majestic in a way aircraft rarely were. To travel aboard it was to move through the sky as if the future had chosen grace over speed. And then, as the ship prepared to land, fire erupted. What followed was astonishingly fast. The airship was consumed in moments, its massive frame collapsing in flame before cameras and crowds. The disaster killed dozens and instantly became one of the defining images of 20th century catastrophe. But what has kept the Hindenburg alive in historical imagination is not only the visual violence of its destruction, it is the lingering uncertainty around the final trigger. How did a vessel so advanced, so publicly visible and so symbolically important meet its end in such a sudden inferno? That question has never completely lost its grip. Hydrogen is the obvious center of the story. The Hindenburg used hydrogen for lift, and hydrogen's danger has made it the most familiar explanation ever since. But familiarity is not the same as completeness. The exact ignition mechanism, the precise sequence of failure, and the relative roles of gas leakage, static electricity, weather conditions, structural issues, or surface materials have all remained subjects of analysis and debate. Some explanations emphasize the flammability of the skin coating. Others focus on leaking hydrogen ignited by static discharge. The broad outline is plausible enough. The final certainty is not absolute enough to silence debate. And that gap matters. Because the Hindenburg was not just a machine, it was a symbol at the intersection of technology, prestige, and national image. Its destruction did more than kill passengers and crew. It shattered confidence in an entire mode of travel. In that sense, the unanswered questions around the fire are bound to something larger than physics. If the disaster could be reduced to one simple cause, history might absorb it more easily. Instead, it lingers in that uncomfortable zone where cause seems near, yet never fully locked in place. The image is clear, the final chain remains just uncertain enough to keep returning us to the blaze. The speed of the event only intensifies that uncertainty. Disasters that unfold gradually allow the mind to imagine intervention, sequence, resistance. The Hindenburg seemed to cross almost instantly from arrival to destruction. That abruptness creates a unique kind of historical unease. One moment the vessel existed as the future in material form. The next it existed as a burning skeleton collapsing in front of its own audience. The transformation feels so violent, so symbolically precise that it is almost cinematic. And because it is cinematic, people keep searching for a final explanation dramatic enough to match the image itself. But sometimes no explanation feels equal to the moment. That may be why the Hindenburg remains so haunting. It was one of those rare events in which spectacle and catastrophe fused so perfectly that the image outlived the technical certainty. Even if a plausible chain can be described, the visual power of the disaster keeps the questions alive. Was this a failure of material choice, of design philosophy, of environmental conditions, of underestimated risk accepted for too long because the machine had not yet betrayed itself? The answers overlap, but no single one feels like the whole flame, and time has only made the symbolism heavier. The Hindenburg now looks, in hindsight, like the death of an alternate future. Airships once suggested one path for modern flight, luxurious, monumental, almost ocean liner-like in the sky. The fire did not simply end one voyage, it helped end belief in that vision. That is why the disaster feels larger than the number of dead. It was a public unmaking, a technological dream burned out before the world's eyes, leaving behind just enough uncertainty to ensure that the final lesson never became completely settled. The Hindenburg disaster was visible, documented, and immediate. Yet even now it leaves behind the kind of question history cannot quite extinguish. When a machine dies so publicly, are we seeing the clear result of known danger, or the final exposure of risks that only became obvious once the future was already on fire? Number 2. The Franklin expedition. Some disasters are terrible because they happen all at once. Others are terrible because they unfold so slowly that the full weight of them seems almost impossible to endure. The Franklin expedition belongs to that second category, and that is one reason it remains so haunting. It was not a single moment of explosion or collapse. It was a drawn-out catastrophe of ice, isolation, failed rescue, and human endurance pushed far beyond the limits of what history can comfortably imagine. In 1845, Sir John Franklin sailed from Britain with 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, and 129 men in an effort to complete the Northwest Passage. The mission carried the confidence of empire. These were advanced vessels for their time, equipped for Arctic conditions, supported by the prestige of a nation that believed planning, discipline, and technology could force the far north to yield. On paper, it was a bold expedition. In reality, it was an encounter with an environment that did not care about paper. At first, disappearance could still be mistaken for delay. The Arctic was remote, communication was limited, ice could hold ships for seasons at a time. Silence was frightening, but not yet unthinkable. As months turned into years, however, concern hardened into dread. Search missions were launched, clues began to surface in fragments, graves on Beachy Island, notes left behind, personal effects scattered across unforgiving ground. Inuit testimony describing starving men, abandoned ships, and a collapse far removed from the confident departure imagined in Britain. The Franklin expedition did not return as a story. It returned as pieces, and that is what made the disaster so difficult to absorb. Because the broad shape became clear enough to horrify. The ships became trapped in ice. Franklin died. The surviving crew eventually abandoned the vessels and attempted an impossible overland escape through one of the harshest regions on Earth. Starvation, exposure, illness, and exhaustion followed. Later analysis raised the possibility of lead poisoning from preserved food systems or ship infrastructure, adding another layer of failure inside the catastrophe. And then there were the darkest suggestions of all, evidence pointing toward cannibalism in the final stages. The kind of detail that transforms a heroic mission into something closer to a nightmare of slow unraveling. Yet even with all that, the unanswered questions never went away. Because disasters like Franklin do not leave behind one decisive scene. They leave a trail, a camp here, a bone there, a written note cut off before it becomes a full confession of events. The history of the expedition is a reconstruction assembled under the pressure of absence. We know enough to understand the scale of the collapse. We do not know enough to inhabit it cleanly. What decisions were made in the final months? How long did hope remain intact? At what point did discipline begin to fail? What exactly turned hardship into doom, and doom into a death march across the ice? Those gaps are where the disaster still lives. The eventual discoveries of Erebus and Terror gave the story new form, but not final peace. Finding the ships mattered enormously. It proved that the Arctic had preserved more than legend. But preservation is not the same as resolution. A wreck can confirm location, condition, even sequence in part. It cannot fully restore the human interior of the event. The fear in the cabins, the conversations of supplies dwindled, the private understanding, if any, that rescue was no longer coming. Those things remained locked beneath the ice more completely than wood and iron ever were. That is why the Franklin expedition left behind unanswered questions as surely as it left behind the dead. Was this disaster sealed the moment the ships entered the wrong conditions, or was there a point at which different decisions might have saved lives? Did technology give the men false confidence? Did the expedition fail because the Arctic was unbeatable, or because imperial assumptions made its dangers harder to read honestly? These are not small questions. They shape the meaning of the entire story. One version frames Franklin as tragic victim of nature. Another suggests something more unsettling, that the disaster was magnified by a culture that believed itself prepared for forces it did not truly understand. The Franklin expedition remains one of history's great catastrophes, not because it is wholly unknown, but because it is only partially known. It gave history bodies without full stories, ships without immediate rescue, and clues without final closure. The farther researchers follow it into the ice, the more they find, and the more they are reminded that discovery does not always defeat mystery. Sometimes it only sharpens the outline of suffering. In that sense, the Arctic did more than trap the expedition. It preserved its unanswered questions, and that may be the coldest thing it left behind. Number 1, the Titanic. Some disasters become legends because of mystery. The Titanic became something worse. It became a disaster so famous that people assume it has been fully explained, when in reality, its fame has only buried the unanswered questions under layer after layer of certainty, myth, spectacle, and retelling. That is what makes it the perfect number 1 on this list. Not because we do not know that the ship struck an iceberg and sank, but because a catastrophe this large is never just one collision. It is a chain of decisions, assumptions, conditions, warnings, design choices, human hierarchies, and moments of hesitation that history has never stopped arguing over. In April 1912, RMS Titanic set out on her maiden voyage as the grand symbol of modern engineering confidence. She was luxurious, enormous, and presented to the public as the latest triumph of human design over the sea. Even now, that image remains central to the story. The ship was not merely a vessel, it was a statement, a floating monument to industrial power, wealth, and the belief that progress had made old fears feel manageable. That is why the sinking struck the world so deeply. It was not only a maritime disaster, it was a humiliation of certainty itself. The impact with the iceberg is the simplest part of the story. The harder part is everything around it. Warnings about ice had been received, speed remained high, lifeboat capacity was disastrously insufficient for everyone aboard. Evacuation unfolded amid confusion, disbelief, class division, procedural weakness, and the terrible human reluctance to grasp catastrophe before it becomes undeniable. Nearby ships were part of the later controversy. Wireless communication became part of the controversy. Visibility, sea conditions, binocular access, steel quality, rivet integrity, design philosophy, compartment theory, and the psychology of command all became part of the controversy. The sinking was a fact. The full meaning of why so many died and which parts were preventable never settled so cleanly. That is what makes the Titanic so enduringly unsettling, because every generation inherits the broad outline and then rediscovers the deeper discomfort. Was the vessel doomed primarily by the iceberg, or by confidence woven into every layer of its operation? How much did speed matter? How much did lifeboat policy matter? How much did social class shape survival? Could more lives have been saved if the seriousness of the damage had been grasped faster, or if evacuation had been enforced with greater urgency from the beginning? These are the kinds of questions that make a disaster live beyond its own century. They turn a sinking into a permanent argument between accident and failure. And the Titanic has always attracted myth because myth offers comfort. A great ship meets a great iceberg. Tragedy follows. The end. But history is rarely that neat. The actual catastrophe was more structurally disturbing than the legend. It exposed the arrogance of enough lifeboats, enough confidence, enough belief in design, enough trust that the Atlantic could be mastered by prestige and engineering. It exposed how slowly human beings can react when the setting is elegant, the music is still playing, and the disaster feels emotionally incompatible with the world around it. It exposed the violence of social order even in the final hours, when not everyone aboard occupied the same relation to rescue, access, and urgency. That is why the Titanic left behind unanswered questions that still matter. Not because the sinking is unsolved in a sensational sense, but because disasters do not become historical ghosts through mystery alone. They become ghosts when the explanation never feels morally complete. The ship lies on the ocean floor, and yet the arguments remain above water. About negligence, about regulation, about design, about command, about who had a chance and who did not, about whether the worst maritime tragedies are born in the instant of impact or in all the invisible decisions made long before it. Time has only deepened that power. The wreck's discovery did not end debate. Films did not end debate. Endless books, diagrams, testimony, and forensic analysis did not end debate. They multiplied it. Because the more closely people look at the Titanic, the less it resembles a simple encounter with fate, and the more it appears as a disaster built from layers of vulnerability hidden inside magnificence. That is the kind of catastrophe history never quite finishes digesting. The Titanic deserves the #1 position because it is the most famous example of a disaster that people think they understand completely. And yet the closer they move toward it, the more it opens. Into arrogance, into inequality, into preventable failure, into the awful realization that one iceberg was only the visible edge of a much larger structure of risk. The Titanic sank in the Atlantic, but its unanswered questions never did.